Hi, this is Nirmal Janardhanan from Condic School of Business and Technology. I'm doing Executive MBA. I belong to the 2020 July cohort. Today I'm going to present the case study on Brazilian stagflation. Before I begin, let me show you my identity card. Let me zoom. Okay, let me zoom back. Okay. To start with, let me give you an overview about the stagflation. It's a combination of stagnant economic growth coupled with inflation. So that means it has high inflation, high unemployment rate, and quite naturally then the low GDP or the economic growth. So in this case, Tombini, who is representing the central bank, is entrusted with the responsibility to handle the current situation whereby the President Rousseff. So this is both an economic challenge as well as a bureaucratic pressure. But to me, this is also an opportunity for career growth for Tombini to bring the company back from the economic slowdown. In this current scenario, Tombini is more interested in bringing down the high inflation because he believes that this can quite naturally handle the high unemployment rate as well as the low GDP. Whereas Rousseff is more interested to directly bring in, reduce the high unemployment rate and bring the GDP back to the higher levels. So to me, this is theoretically a complex problem because according to Phillips curve, both inflation and unemployment rate have a inverse relationship. So this is where we need to handle it in a more careful manner such that both the inflation and the high unemployment rate can be then brought down. The first step would be to identifying the causes for the inflation and then combat accordingly. In pure layman terms, we need to first identify whether there is whether the situation is a negative externality. For example, in this current scenario itself, it is very clear that the currency, the Brazilian real currency, has plummeted. We can also identify whether there are any particular goods that are impacting the demand and supply, like for example the increased oil price which happened in the 1970s. We could also explore regulation to reduce the consumption of such import of such goods. We should also explore ways to increase the domestic production of such imported goods. And another way is to explore substitute goods. For example, in case of oil prices, it would be the alternate energy. So to continue, we could probably analyze this with the macroeconomics principles. Let's say we choose the aggregate demand and supply model of stagflation. So it's very clear that the real GDP is actually moved towards left, increasing the price level because of the change in aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So we need to find out ways to achieve a macroeconomic equilibrium by pushing the real GDP towards the potential GDP by shifting towards the right. We need to handle in such a scenario combat in inflation and exchange rate, increase the economic growth, and also we need to see the impact of such decisions and policy making on the recession and expansion scenario, because this is expansion recession are always in a cycle. So to begin with, I would say we should try out the different strategies using monetary policy. For example, it could be an expansionary monetary policy where we could increase the aggregate demand, decrease the interest rate, decrease the required reserve ratio by the central bank, and also we could also apply open market operations like buying bonds. This will have positive and negative impacts. For example, the GDP as well as the per capita GDP will be increased and unemployment rate could be decreased, which are positive impacts. Whereas the negative impact would be the still further increase of inflation. That's where we should talk about more about the contractionary monetary policy to bring down the inflation. This would be done by decreasing the aggregate demand, increasing the interest rate, increasing the required reserve ratio, and also applying market operations like selling the bonds. This will have a positive impact on inflation, but at the same time this will have a negative impact on the GDP and the per capita GDP, and also increasing the unemployment rate further high. So I would rather choose the contractionary monetary policy to begin with, and then later switch on to the expansionary monetary policy once the inflation is under control. But this is not enough. We need to also apply good fiscal policies. So some strategies that I thought are enlisted here. To begin with, based on the past history of based on what the previous president did, I would just simplify the tax code and the tax rebates for economic growth, and also bring in infrastructure investment through public and private partnership. This will eventually help to bring up the economic slowdown. Then other aspect would be to reduce the government spending to reduce inflation rates. One of the bad things that happened with the Brazilian economy was the issues in doing the business. So the government should actually bring in the fiscal policy to increase ease of doing businesses. So based on the exhibit, there are certain things that we could try it out. One is reducing the cost of doing the businesses, identifying and removing the barriers of entry of market. Then simply introduce a simpler and faster procedures for startups so that there are more people coming forward to do businesses. And if you want to further to bring in an open market, we should actually increase the foreign investment and allow the people from outside the country to actually invest in the country itself. And for the domestic market, we should explore new areas and also invest money in research and technology that should be meant primarily for a long-term growth. Since we know that corruption has been an issue with Brazil, as mentioned by the recent scandal that mentioned in the case study, I would assume that bringing stricter rules for combating tax evasions and corruption would be a step forward. And once the inflation reduces, we should introduce pegging mechanism to keep the constant exchange rate with the stable currency, let's say like US dollars. On the summary, I would say applying the contractionary monetary policy should be the primary approach so that the inflation and exchange rates can be handled. We should then apply the expansionary monetary policy as a secondary approach to improve the economic growth. At the same time, we should also use the expansionary fiscal policy as a supplemental approach for continuous economic growth. And we can then expect the market self-corrections based on these policy actions. And as always, we should focus on the long-term solution rather than just the short-term. Some references: my primary reading materials has been from the context study materials and some online materials. Thank you.